This is an original 17th century rapier. That's right, a real rapier from the 17th century. And this is a modern HEMA replica rapier of a 17th century style, but very much made in recent years with a blunt tip there for use in HEMA fencing. So we've got an original 17th century rapier and we've got a modern 21st century rapier. So what do you think this is, or indeed this? Because they're not what you think. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, because I'm an antique arms and armour dealer, as well as a HEMA fencer and sometimes reenactor as well, I have the great pleasure and honour of getting to handle lots of replica arms and armour, but also lots of original period arms and armour. And obviously, sometimes in the antique world, we come across replicas that are being sold as original things. And unfortunately, once we go back beyond the 18th century, this becomes particularly more the case. So for example, medieval swords, unfortunately, even in auctions today, there are lots of swords being sold in auctions as medieval, be they 14th, 15th, 13th, whatever century, that unfortunately aren't. They are fakes that have been very convincingly made to varying degrees in, let's say, the last 50 years, and sometimes even in the Victorian period as well. So in the antique world, we come across rapiers. But of course, as well as replicas which are intended to fool people, there are also replicas which are purely made as replicas. Like, for example, HEMA fencing weapons, which aren't designed to fool anybody. They're not going to be sold as antiques for thousands of pounds. They're simply sold as practice weapons. And interestingly, in past periods, as we're going to look at in a minute, there were types of sword which were made as honest replicas. Now, the first important piece of context to throw at you is that 17th and 16th century swords are much more numerous than earlier centuries. So when we're talking about the medieval period, let's say up to the 15th century, the surviving swords and indeed armour from those periods are far, far more scarce than once we get into the 16th and 17th centuries, i.e. the age of the rapier and the side sword and early back swords and things like this. Largely because, first of all, they were made in greater numbers in that period. Generally speaking, populations were increasing at this time as well, so there are more people around. Also, the size of armies and military engagements, the English Civil War, the 30 Years' War, sometimes involved really big numbers of people, bigger than your average medieval war. But in addition to those things, there's a greater degree of preservation, partly because obviously the 16th and 17th centuries are closer to us in time than the 15th century and further back. But in addition to that, it is to do with the way that these were produced and kept. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, many of these swords were produced in large arms making manufacturing centres like in Solingen or Passau or Hounslow in just outside London, for example, now part of London but used to be just outside London. These sorts of places that were producing huge numbers of swords for large standing armies and some more professionalism of military forces at this time. So number one, more of them were made, but secondly, many of these were kept in arsenals or essentially warehouses of weapons. Okay, and this is really the root of what the Royal Armouries is, as you know, who I do replica work with today. It started out essentially the state arsenal, and you know, Spain has one, France had a couple, and so on and so forth. So it became common to stockpile weapons, not just swords, of course, but things like firearms, cannons, cannonballs, arrows, everything you can think of, in case there was a big war, essentially, so that there wasn't a problem supplying munitions for the large armies that they had to be raised, or even the large standing armies of the time. So 17th and less so 16th, but particularly 17th century armaments are more common than earlier centuries, and by the 19th century, they were relatively cheap. I mean, assuming that you were the sort of person that owned their own house, in some cases who might own quite a big house. And so there was a rather buoyant market in buying antique arms and armour to decorate your house. And this really reaches its apex in what we know as the Gothic revival period, which really starts out in the early 1800s and runs all the way through to the late 1800s. It was starting to become a little bit less fashionable by the year 1900. But throughout the 1800s, there's this Gothic revival. And we even see buildings, things like the Natural History Museum in London was built in Gothic revival style. England's Houses of Parliament, Britain's Houses of Parliament, built in Gothic revival style by Alfred Waterhouse, if I remember correctly. So this was a particular architectural style, but also or artistic style, and it also fueled passion and interest in things like Arthurian tales and Robin Hood books and stuff like this. So, these types of swords, 17th century swords, you know, as featured in Alexandre Dumas' Three Musketeers, of course a 19th century work set in the 17th century, were extremely popular decorative items that were put in relatively rich people's houses, and lots of people wanted these sorts of things adorning their walls. And so, for example, if we go to many English country houses, we'll find things like this late 17th century pikeman's helmet. This is an original one. This would have been high up, kind of hung up and decorating various things above fireplaces and stuff like this, would have been a popular style of thing to have as decoration. And in some cases, some of those houses actually would have had a local militia going all the way back to the 17th century, and these may have been literally leftovers of what the militia from the time of the English Civil War and then the later sort of Jacobite period, they would have had arms and armour that would have been kept actually for use in the 18th century, or 17th and 18th century, would have been kept as decoration in the 19th century because it had become fashionable by that point. And of course, military styles of swords actually in use changed hugely during this time. So by the late 19th century, swords that looked like this 1890 pattern cavalry sabre, were the standard military swords. But these archaic, older styles of sword, even relatively recent, like Highland broadswords from the late 1700s, were extremely popular to have as decoration in houses. But at a certain point, there were more people with fancy houses wanting this sort of decoration than actual original artifacts available to buy. So if all the antique arms and armour is kind of running out because there's more customers for it than actual things to buy, what do you do? Well, to a certain extent, you move into the realms of what modern fakers, or indeed the replica markets in places like China and Pakistan and India have moved into in the modern day. You start making new ones. And that's actually what happened in parts of Britain and Germany and France in the 19th century. So what we have here might appear to be a 17th century swept hilt rapier. And there were replicas that were made as fakes, absolutely, and sold as antiques, and that's obviously got a monetary, essentially a criminal monetary motivation behind it. But this isn't one of those, and I have to say, this handles absolutely wonderfully. There are things that I can see about it up close which make me realise this isn't a 17th century rapier, this is a 19th century rapier, and there's another big clue I'll show you in a second. But in terms of actual functionality and how this handles and moves and everything else, it's great. It's fully heat treated, it's a good quality steel blade, it's sharp, and it is clearly designed and could be used every bit as well as a 17th century rapier. But here's the reason I know that this isn't trying to be a fake. So for the antique sword collectors around here, this might be somewhat surprising. That says SJ Pillin. That is a famous maker of military swords of the late 19th century. And in fact, I have here an Edwardian, so that's Edward the 7th between 1902 and 1910, so early years of the 20th century. Infantry officer's sword, standard regulation 1897 pattern. Okay, this is actually a presentation one, but if we look at the base of the blade here, you can hopefully see on camera SJ Pillin. So it's the exact same maker, could be the exact same period. So makers who were making completely functional, proved and, you know, battle proved and intended to be used in war military officers' swords were also making rapiers. Now, why? So when I first found this, this is a very interesting thing. I've never seen a rapier made by Pillin before. I have seen one made by Wilkinson, but we'll come on to that in a second. This was made by Pillin, and why was it made? Well, my first thought is that made for theatrical use? Well, I don't think it's made for theatrical use, although it could have been used for ceremonial use, could have been worn as part of some kind of costume. Absolutely. The only thing which makes me think not is that is incredibly pointy for something not intended, or rather intended not to be like dangerous, essentially. That is a really, really pointy end to the blade. So although the edges are not sharpened, That is very, very pointy, and I don't think that a theatrical weapon would have been made that pointy, because it would have been quite dangerous to have on stage if you were doing a version of Romeo and Juliet or whatever, you know, Shakespearean sort of theatricals, Rigoletto or whatever. It's not impossible though. It is slightly possible that this was made for something like the Royal Opera House or something like that. I, however, suspect that this was made for some other purpose which is not very clear, and it could have just been for decorative purposes. But for the purposes of this video, the really important thing to point out is that it is not a fake in the standard sense of people thinking of a fake, because they've put their maker's mark on there. So they're not pretending that this is a 17th century rapier. They've made it exactly like a 17th century rapier. It feels like one, it's proportioned like one, it's really nicely made, and it's made of functional spring steel of the same quality as a real military sword. But they've put their name and address on it, so they're not pretending that it's a 17th century rapier. So it's for some other purpose that remains slightly unclear. At this point, I have to mention another use of rapiers or archaic weapons in the late 19th century, which sometimes gets overlooked, and that is the birth of HEMA. So often when we talk about HEMA, historical European martial arts, we're talking about the revival of HEMA, and we think about something which started in the 1990s, and now we're in 2026, it's quite established sport or martial art. Obviously we have tournaments, there are clubs all over the world, loads of, you can even find HEMA clubs in Japan and China, all over the place. It's become a big activity. When I started out HEMA in 1997, it was in its fledgling days. But those weren't the first fledgling days. The first people to revive the old martial arts of medieval and Renaissance Europe were actually in the 19th century. Things like the Eglinton tournament in the, what was it, 1830s, something like that. So really quite early, but certainly by the time we get to the 1880s, we start to see actually it's kind of got some momentum. People like Egerton Castle and Alfred Hutton and Cyril Matthey are actually writing books. And so a lot of us, when we started out HEMA, we discovered these books talking about 16th and 17th century swordplay, but written in the 19th century. And they were literally putting on demonstrations, they were having tournaments, a bit like we do now, but they were doing it more than 100 years ago. So, interestingly, they had a similar challenge to us. They had to have training weapons. Now, they could have gone and used original period swords, but the problem is they're sharp, and of course they're maybe not that robust for practice purposes. They could have gone and got replicas made, okay, but the problem is, again, you've got issues. Okay, you're not going to make a pointy replica, you need to really make a fencing version. And so they come to a similar place to us, that you need something that is blunt, that has a somewhat flexible blade and has a blunt tip, so you can actually use it for fencing. So that's what they did. They already had practice weapons for bayonets, for sabres, for cutlasses, they had single sticks. They had various types of practice weapon for their military weapons of the day, of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. And so that's exactly what they did, and that's what this is. This is literally a late 19th century, possibly beginning of the 20th century, practice sword. And amazingly, just before I show you the rest of its features, I'll get this close to this has got a whopping great, it's nearly a 15-inch blade on it, this one. Hopefully you'll be able to see on camera there, we've got Wilkinson of Pall Mall. So yet again, much like the Pillin sword, this is made by the top maker, the top British maker of military swords of the day. I've shown many Wilkinson swords from the 19th century on this channel. What I've not shown before is a Wilkinson rapier, because that's what this thing is. This thing, you know, it's got a flexible blade. Let's look at the tip. It is a nail tip, purposely made, squared off nail tip. It has a bowl guard, which funnily enough kind of rings like a bell. It actually sounds like it's from some kind of bell, so it must be, I would imagine it's hardened steel. We've got a fairly simple cross guard with no knuckle bow. We've got a sort of tubular section around the ricasso there that makes it more comfortable to put your finger around. We've got a wire wrapped grip, and we've got a very simple pommel, and the whole thing is peened at the end. So what we have here is functionally something extremely similar, except with a slightly longer blade, made for essentially 19th century HEMA, and that's Wilkinson. and this sharp one is Pillin. So there we go. Not all 19th century rapiers are fakes. This wasn't made as a fake. The Pillin one wasn't made as a fake. They were made to fulfill the appetite in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Victorian and Edwardian period, for rapiers, or for archaic swords. Swords which were no longer being used on the battlefield, but were being used either to decorate houses or for theatrical fencing, the equivalent of movies before movies were a thing, or indeed for the early days of HEMA. And certainly that is what this was made for, very clearly, because of the blunt tip, flexible blade and very simplified hilt. This is essentially one of the earliest HEMA weapons in terms of HEMA revival weapons that I'm aware of anywhere in the world. It's a very, very rare thing made by Wilkinson. So there we go. Obviously, this is a fairly fringe of a fringe interest, but I think it's a fascinating thing that needs to be documented. Military sword makers of the 19th century were also making archaic swords, sometimes for fencing, sometimes for decoration or whatever this was made for. And I think it's an interesting little corner of arms and armour study which has been widely overlooked until now. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, I will continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.